Hey everyone, welcome back. We're diving back into some malicious compliance stories. Today we've got 3 tales of people who used rules, measurements, and sheer nerve to fight back against entitlement. One involves a neighborhood that weaponized wildlife habitat signs against code complaints. Another, a utility meter reader who learned that 18 inches is exactly 18 inches. And the last, a warehouse manager who decided a membership fee doesn't buy a human being. Here we go. One wildlife habitat sign stopped every code complaint on my street. I live in what I like to call a pocket neighborhood. It's not gated, not fancy, not particularly trendy. It's just a little cluster of homes tucked off a main road where for years the loudest thing you'd hear was someone's wind chimes or a lawnmower on a Saturday morning. When I first moved in, most of my neighbors were retirees, sweet older couples who'd been there since the houses were built. If someone's hip was acting up, someone else mowed their lawn. If a storm knocked down a branch, 3 people would show up with gloves and a thermos of coffee. No HOA, no drama, just people living their lives. Then time did what time does. The older folks started downsizing or moving closer to their kids. In their place came a wave of younger homeowners. Corporate types, dual-income couples, fresh landscaping trucks parked out front, matching SUVs. You could practically smell the scented candles and ambition. At first it was fine. Kids played outside, people waved, but then the city code violation notices started showing up. One neighbor got a letter about grass height, another got a warning about overgrowth. Someone else was cited because their flower bed along the sidewalk wasn't clearly defined. That one was especially ridiculous, because apparently in our town, if flowers and plantings aren't bordered with a neat little edge or stone divider, they're considered lawn. And lawn has to be under 12 inches. So suddenly, longtime residents were digging up tulips that had been there for decades. Bulbs that only bloom in spring were being yanked out because for most of the year, they just looked like dirt. One older woman down the street had a row of wildflowers she'd planted in memory of her husband. She got a citation because they weren't inside a tidy rectangle. It didn't take long to figure out what was happening. Someone was calling it in. You could feel it at block get-togethers, the polite smiles, the slightly too long glances at people's yards. Nobody said it out loud, but everyone knew. The new crowd didn't like the messy look of natural gardens. One afternoon I was talking to Tom, who lives 2 houses down from me. He's the kind of guy who reads statutes for fun. You know, he said, leaning against his mailbox, the state has a wildlife habitat designation. I blinked. What does that do? He grinned. It basically says you're intentionally maintaining native habitat for pollinators and wildlife, and once you're designated, city code can't force you to mow it down as long as you meet the requirements. What are the requirements? I asked, expecting something complicated. Half your plants have to be native. That was it. No inspection from the governor, no environmental thesis, just make sure at least 50% of what's growing in your yard is native to the state, file a little application, and post the official sign. We did the math. Let's say you got 25 trees, shrubs, and assorted plants in your yard. You plant 26 native flowering plants, boom, you're officially a wildlife habitat. The next month was like watching a quiet revolution. Suddenly, neighbors were comparing notes about native species, coneflowers, milkweed, goldenrod, serviceberry shrubs. People who had never cared about botany were standing in driveways discussing pollinator density. That's the beautiful part. They came for your flowers and they ended up turning the whole neighborhood into amateur botanists. All those complaints about messy yards just made people dig in deeper, literally. The wildlife habitat designation wasn't just a loophole. It was a whole new way of thinking about what a yard should look like. I went all in. I already had a couple of native trees, so I added a bunch of native perennials. I edged nothing. No neat borders, just clusters of plants doing their thing. Then I filed the application online. 2 weeks later, a little metal sign arrived in the mail, certified wildlife habitat. I posted it right at the front of my yard. The first time code compliance drove by after that, I happened to be outside. The officer slowed down, looked at the sign, then drove off without stopping. Word spread fast. The house across the street put up their sign next, then the one on the corner. Within 3 months, nearly every other house in the neighborhood had that same little sign planted proudly in the yard. It became a joke. Hey, have you met the new people in 14B? Someone would say. They're not habitat yet. Even some of the newer couples quietly joined in. Turns out once you learn about native plants and how much less maintenance they require, they're kind of hard to resist. But not everyone was thrilled. One evening I was watering a patch of milkweed when I saw a woman from 2 doors down, the one with the pristine turf and matching porch furniture, standing at the edge of my property. "Your yard looks wild," she said carefully. "Thanks," I replied. "It's a wildlife habitat." She glanced at the sign. "Yes, I've noticed everyone seems to be doing that." "It's state approved," I said. "City can't touch it." She didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at the bees bouncing from flower to flower. "Well," she finally muttered, "I suppose it's good for the environment." That was the last time anyone got a code violation letter for overgrowth. Now when you drive through our little pocket neighborhood, it looks different than it used to. It's not manicured suburbia, it's layered and colorful. In spring, it's ridiculous with blooms. In summer, it hums with bees and butterflies. In fall, the grasses sway like we planned it that way all along. The funny part is that it's still technically within the rules. We didn't break anything. We just read the fine print and leaned into it. Every time I see that little metal sign in my yard, I smile. The same neighbors who once had to rip out flowers are now proudly cultivating native plants like it's a competitive sport. Turns out if you push a quiet neighborhood hard enough over 12-inch grass, you might just end up with a full-blown ecological uprising. And honestly, it looks better this way. And our second story. Sometimes compliance is the best revenge. A few years back, I worked as a quality control coordinator in a boiler fabrication shop. It sounds more impressive than it felt most days. My office was technically a desk wedged into a corner of the utility room, right between a mop sink and a filing cabinet from 1983 that smelled faintly of burnt dust. My job was to read codes all day. ASME sections, customer specifications, welding procedures, inspection reports. If there was a regulation somewhere that said something had to be a certain distance from something else, I probably knew about it. One morning, I'd just gotten in. It was early. I hadn't had my coffee yet, and the shop was still in that quiet pre-shift haze where the welders hadn't fully woken up either. I was pouring myself a cup from the ancient drip machine we kept on a side table when the utility meter reader walked in. She came by every month to read the gas and electric meters mounted along the far wall of the utility room. It was a tight setup. In front of the meters, we usually had a couple of folding tables covered in final documentation packages, inspection reports, pressure test certs, material traceability paperwork, all stacked in neat but sprawling piles. I looked up, smiled, and said, "Good morning. Coffee?" She didn't smile back. Instead, in a tone that could have cut sheet metal, she snapped, "These tables have to be 18 inches away from the meters. That's code. They're too close." I blinked. "Oh, good morning to you too." She folded her arms. "They need to be moved. Now." I was caught off guard, not by the content of what she said, but by the delivery. There was no, "Hey, just a heads up," or "Could you shift these a bit?" It was straight to DEFCON 1 over a folding table. Silently, I set my coffee down and reached into my desk drawer. Out came my tape measure. Years of code reading have a way of making you a little literal. I walked over to the tables. They were probably a foot from the meters, give or take. Not blocking them, just not precisely compliant if you were feeling picky. I hooked the tape measure on the wall beside the meter bank and extended it. 18 inches, right? I asked. "Yes," she replied, watching me like a hawk. I pulled the tables out exactly 18 inches. Not 19, not 20, not a comfortable working distance. Exactly 18 inches from the meter face to the nearest table edge. I checked it twice. Then I walked back to my desk, sat down, and picked up my coffee. Now here's the part that made it interesting. The tables ran nearly 8 feet along the wall. By moving them out precisely 18 inches, I created a long, narrow corridor between the table edge and the opposite wall. It was technically compliant. It was also just wide enough to squeeze through if you turned sideways and committed to the journey. She stared at the setup, then she stared at me. I smiled politely and took a sip. Without another word, she turned sideways and began shuffling down the newly created gap. It was not a graceful process. She had to inch along the entire 8-foot stretch, clutching her clipboard, muttering under her breath while shooting me laser beam glares the whole way. I said nothing. I just watched, coffee in hand, as she completed what looked like the world's least dignified obstacle course. When she reached the meter, she huffed, bent over, took her readings, and then began the long sideways trek back toward the door. The entire time, I maintained a calm, neutral expression that I had perfected during countless customer audits. This is the part that makes the whole thing worth it. She demanded compliance. You gave her exact, literal, documented compliance. The fact that it made her job harder wasn't your problem. That was the natural consequence of her own demand. And you got to watch her shuffle sideways for 8 feet while sipping coffee. That's not revenge, that's just math. Once she cleared the gauntlet, she paused at the doorway. "You know, this is ridiculous," she said. I shrugged. "It's exactly 18 inches. That's what you asked for." She opened her mouth, closed it, then turned and left without another word. The welders, who'd been pretending not to watch, burst out laughing the moment the door closed. One of them leaned into the utility room and said, "You gonna leave it like that?" "Until further notice," I replied. The table stayed exactly 18 inches from the meters for the rest of the week. Every time I walked past them, I double-checked with the tape measure just to be sure. You never know when compliance might be audited. The next month, when she returned, she walked in a little less aggressively. "Morning," she said. "Coffee?" I asked. She hesitated, then nodded. "Sure." I handed her a cup. Before she could say anything about the tables, I said, "They're 18 inches out, verified." She glanced at them, then at the tape measure sitting on my desk. "That's fine," she muttered. She didn't mention the spacing again. Eventually, once things cooled off and we needed the workspace back, I moved the tables out a bit more, far enough that no one had to reenact a sideways hallway crawl. But for that one glorious week, they sat at exactly 18 inches, because that was what had been demanded. There's something deeply satisfying about following instructions to the letter, especially when you spend your days swimming in regulations and specifications. And that first sip of coffee, watching her navigate that narrow passage she'd insisted on, still one of the more satisfying coffees I've ever had. And our last story. Toxic Karen has been banned from our store. I work at one of those big box warehouse stores where you pay a membership fee just for the privilege of walking through the door. It's great for bulk groceries, cheap rotisserie chickens, and the occasional impulse kayak purchase. It's also apparently a magnet for people who believe their annual fee entitles them to control the laws of supply and demand. Most customers are fine. They flash their membership card, load up on toilet paper like it's the apocalypse, and go home happy. But every now and then, you get someone who treats that plastic card like it's a royal decree. Last week, I was minding my own business near the front end when my walkie crackled to life. "Manager to aisle 12, we've got a situation." The tone told me it wasn't a spilled jar of salsa. I headed toward the healthy foods aisle and could already hear yelling before I turned the corner. "What do you mean you don't have any more brown rice?" a woman screeched. I saw Ryan, one of our newer associates, standing there looking like he'd been caught in a tornado. Ryan's about 22, polite to a fault, and genuinely tries to help everyone. "Sorry, ma'am," he was saying, holding the handheld scanner. "I checked the system and it shows we're completely out of stock." The woman, mid-50s, expensive handbag, the kind of energy that makes nearby shoppers suddenly need to compare labels very intensely, threw her arms up. "You people are so useless. What's the point of paying to shop here if you can't even stock basic food?" That's when I stepped in. "Hi there," I said, keeping my voice even. "Ryan's correct. We're out of brown rice at the moment. Is there something else I can help you find?" She pivoted toward me like I'd personally stolen her last grain. "Yes," she snapped. "Get me some damn brown rice." "I'm sorry," I replied. "There isn't any in the aisle, and the system confirms we don't have any in the building. We're expecting a shipment tomorrow, so if you—" "I own you," she shouted, loud enough that someone 2 aisles over dropped a bag of quinoa. "I pay to shop here. I demand that you bring me brown rice now. I don't care if you have to go to another store to get it. I want it, and I want it now. You're no more than my maid." There are moments in retail where your brain splits in two. One half is reciting corporate policy, the other half is asking whether prison orange would complement your skin tone. I've dealt with rude customers before. Snappy comments, eye rolls, the occasional, "Do you know how much I spend here?" But being told someone owned me because they paid a membership fee? Something in me just clicked. I looked her dead in the eye and said very calmly, just because you pay to shop here does not give you the right to act like a stuck-up bee. Time stopped. Ryan inhaled so sharply I thought he might pass out. A couple nearby customers froze mid-step. The woman's face went pale, then flushed a violent shade of red. "I'm going to have you fired," she shrieked. "I'm going to fire you. You can't talk to me like that." Without another word, I turned and walked away. My heart was pounding, and I was fully prepared to clear out my locker. I'd never spoken to a customer like that in my life, but the relief I felt was unreal. 15 minutes later, I was called to the back office. I walked in expecting the lecture of my career. Instead, my manager was sitting there with his arms crossed and a look I couldn't quite read. "Close the door," he said. I braced myself. Before he could say anything, he held up a hand. I heard the entire interaction. My stomach dropped. He leaned back in his chair. I was in the next aisle over doing a price audit. She started yelling, so I stayed put. I blinked. "Oh?" "She told Ryan she owned him, told you that you were her maid, and demanded we go to another store to buy her rice." "Yes," I said quietly. He exhaled through his nose and shook his head. "You probably shouldn't have called her that." I nodded. "I know." He paused, then added, "But I understand why you did." I looked up, surprised. "She crossed a line," he continued. "We don't tolerate abusive staff here, membership fee or not." He picked up a printed form from his desk and slid it toward me. "I revoked her membership," he said, "refunded the remainder of her annual fee, and banned her from the store." I stared at him. "You're kidding." "Nope, she's no longer welcome." I told her that if she believes paying a membership means she owns our employees, she can shop somewhere else. This manager's a rare breed. Most would have folded the second a customer started screaming. Instead, he listened from the next aisle, let her dig her own grave, and then handed you the shovel. Revoking her membership wasn't just about the incident. It was a statement that the store has a spine. Apparently, when she went to customer service to demand my termination, she doubled down, loudly, in front of a supervisor, repeated the "I own you" line, and added a few other colorful remarks about how we were nothing without members like her. My manager let her talk herself right out the door. The best part? She tried to argue that she was one of our top customers. Turns out she'd spent less than $800 in the past year. Hardly the retail equivalent of royalty. Word spread through the store quickly. Ryan found me later and said, "I thought you were done for." But that was kind of amazing. I thought I was done for too, I admitted. The next day I came in expecting corporate fallout. There wasn't any. In fact, I got a quiet pat on the back from another supervisor who said, "We can't say it, but we've all thought it." Since then, we haven't seen her. No dramatic return, no lawyer, no follow-up email from corporate demanding my head. Just peace in the brown rice aisle. Every time I walk past that empty shelf now, I can't help but smile a little. We restocked the next day like we always do. The world kept spinning. And somewhere out there, I imagine she's standing in another store, membership card in hand, learning that it still doesn't make her anyone's owner. Let's talk about who really won. Story 1 was collective action. One neighbor found the loophole, and within months, the whole street had certified wildlife habitats. The code complaints stopped cold because the rules literally couldn't touch them. That's not rebellion, that's just gardening with a law degree. Story 2 was precision. She demanded 18 inches, she got 18 inches, measured, verified, and maintained for a full week. The fact that she had to sideways shuffle 8 feet to do her job was just the natural consequence of her own demand, and she got coffee out of it eventually. But story 3 wins, not because calling someone a stuck-up bee was the right move. It wasn't, but because of the manager. Most bosses would have folded. Instead, he listened from the next aisle, let her dig her own grave, and then revoked her membership. That's not just support, that's a spine made of titanium. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.